The committee will come to order. The committee is meeting today to hear testimony on HR 5986, the Environmental Justice for All Act. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member and his designee today, Mr. Gosar from Arizona. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository HNRC docs at mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members of are responsible for their own microphones as well with our in-person meetings, members may be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noises. Finally, member or witnesses experience technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Let me now turn to the opening statement. I want to welcome everybody to this hearing and thank our witnesses for testifying about one of the most egregious inequities under current laws, the lack of environmental justice for everyone. All people have the right to clean air, clean water, and an environment that enriches their lives. For too many, these rights are unrealized, and that discrimination leads to continuous suffering for environmental justice communities. Communities of color, low-income communities, tribal and indigenous communities, fossil fuel dependent community, and other vulnerable populations such as persons with disability, children, and the elderly continue to disproportionately be burdened by environmental hazards. These hazards include significant exposures to polluted air, waterways, and landscapes. We also see environmental justice disparities through a lack of equitable access to green spaces, public recreation opportunities, or information on community exposure to environmental hazards. These environmental justice disparities have reached a crisis level and it demands the attention of Congress and action by Congress. I've been proud to work over the past 2 years in a partnership with Representative McEachin to put together a comprehensive environmental justice bill that is before us today. Importantly, this bill has been developed by environmental justice communities themselves through an inclusive, transparent, and community-led process. I want to extend my sincere appreciation to my friend, Representative McEachin, for his leadership and the perseverance on this issue. His deep commitment to grounding these efforts in empathy and understanding, and his insistence on a transparent, participatory public input process driven by impacted EJ communities has been key, an absolute key to crafting meaningful and comprehensive environmental legislation. I also want to acknowledge Representatives DeGette and Barragan from our committee, as well as Representative Chakowski, Gomez, Meng, Kilmer, and also from our committee, Representative Garcia and Holland for portions of their legislation and policy recommendations to the environmental justice that were incorporated in the Environmental Justice for All Act, and for their own efforts, every one of them, to develop solutions for EJ communities. The legislation before this furthers environmental justice objectives in a variety of ways. The bill includes several provisions to ensure more equitable access to parks and recreation opportunities for underserved community. The bill requires federal agencies to provide early and meaningful community involvement opportunities under NEPA when proposing an action affecting an environmental justice community, and strengthens tribal input opportunities under NEPA. The bill strengthens and restores civil rights protections for communities facing greater environmental hazards on the basis of race, color, or national origin. It increases transparency, coordination, and accountability from federal agencies when they are carrying out activities affecting environmental justice communities. Today, we're going to hear from several witnesses who are experts in their fields and also experts in their lived experiences working with and living in environmental justice communities. We hope their testimony today will inform our committee on the urgent need to empower communities to protect their natural resources and realize their right to clean air, clean water, and healthy outdoor spaces. These rights are not being met for far too many communities, and doing something about it is what today's hearing is about. I also want to say that, the significant portions, almost the entirety of the Environmental Justice for All Act has been incorporated in other pieces of legislation and recommendations. And for that, Mr. McEachin and all the 18 original co-sponsors to the legislation are very grateful to leadership and to our colleagues on and the other chairs of committees like Judiciary and Energy and Commerce and Education as well, Mr. Scott as well. We appreciate their efforts. With that, let me now turn to my colleague from Arizona and the ranking member for this meeting, Representative Gosa. The time is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, and thank you to the witnesses for taking the time to join us today to discuss how to best serve environmental justice communities. HR 5986, the Environmental Justice for All Act, sponsored by Chairman Grijalva, seeks to achieve the laudable and bipartisan goal of lifting up and revitalizing low-income and minority communities. However, predictably, my colleague seems to somehow accomplish this by imposing a slew of new environmental mandates rather than incentivizing investment and free market growth where it is sorely needed. This legislation pushes continual victimizing handouts versus the empowering incentives that are enterprising hand-ups. First, this legislation expands their already onerous regulatory approval process under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, ensuring further delays in new infrastructure and energy development. This bill goes a step further and requires federal agencies to develop a so-called community impact report, assessing potential environmental hazards for any federal action, even those that concerns have already been addressed under NEPA, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act. While well-intentioned, I think common sense tells us that every project that might make a meaningful difference in improving a vulnerable community will be derailed by endless litigation if this bill passes. Renewable energy, broadband, affordable housing, and almost any new infrastructure will have to clear the impossible hurdles created by this language. Unfortunately, implementing this legislation will cause these communities at most risk to miss out on important opportunities to improve their communities, create jobs, and attract investment. Further, this bill imposes new fees on oil, gas, and coal industries and transfers those revenues to communities and workers that have lost conventional energy jobs. These new fees will cause unnecessary job losses in the energy sector and ensure that this new revenue stream for economic development assistance is ultimately eliminated by destroying the energy industry. We all know that these fees will be a drop in the bucket compared to the economic hardships experienced in communities where entire industries have been dismantled. Just ask the hardworking people in Appalachia about the struggle to overcome tens of thousands of jobs lost in the coal industry in just a few years' time. This bill will do the very same thing to energy producing states out west, leaving them with staggering job losses, insufficient revenue to generate new economic development, and inadequate revenues to handle public education. Overly ambitious environmental restrictions like those included in the bill before us today have already caused significant harm to American households where they have been deployed. Unfortunately, in states like California, rolling blackouts are becoming commonplace as wildfires rage due in part to neglectful forest management. Can we really afford to take California's policies nationwide? Can the most disadvantaged communities afford all of this red tape as they wait on affordable housing, reliable energy, and state-of-the-art broadband and infrastructure to come to their neighborhood? Most importantly, can we afford to ask our most vulnerable communities to take yet another risk of an entirely new regulatory regime as we work to recover from a global pandemic? I was pleased to sign on to a bill introduced by my colleague, Representative Hearn, just this morning to study and address energy poverty in low-income, minority, rural, and senior populations across this country. This bill, the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act, draws on many of the recommendations that our Republican witness, Mr. Hawley, made before this committee when he testified here just last year. As my colleagues on the other side continue to introduce bill after bill aimed at destroying our industry, energy and economy, and tying up every federal action aimed at modernizing our infrastructure and litigation, We must ensure that we have the mechanism in place to analyze the impact of these regulations on at-risk communities. If we are able to understand the true impact of these Washington mandates before they are implemented, perhaps we can avoid causing further harm to American households in pursuit of our colleagues' lofty Green New Deal fantasies. I look forward to hear from the witnesses today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when time has expired. I recommend that members and witnesses joining us remotely use the grid view so that they may pin the timer to on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise, and I will allow the entire panel to testify before the questioning begins. Let me now begin by recognizing Mr. Derek Hawley. He's the president of Reaching America, a nonprofit group he founded that addresses issues affecting the Black community, such as criminal justice reform, occupational licensing, energy poverty, and free speech. He is the host of the weekly Reaching America on Demand podcast. He is also the national sales manager for the Black Focus Radio 1 media network, now called Urban One. He is a graduate of East Tennessee State University, where he earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Broadcast Management and Communications, and a recipient of that university's Alumni Award of Honor. With that, let me turn to you, sir. You have 5 minutes, and welcome, sir. Let me ask the stat.
So, can you hear me?
Mr. Hawley?
This is the third time before the committee. And Mr. Chairman, as you know, one of the issues I do the most work on is reducing energy poverty. Energy poverty occurs and exists when low-income families or individuals spend upwards of 30% of their total income on their electric bill. And I believe it would be fair to say many Americans who struggled with rising energy costs before COVID-19 are struggling even more now. And with millions still out of work, many are experiencing energy poverty for the first time. We know that communities around the country, particularly low-income, minority, rural, and senior citizen communities, suffer from a lack of access to reliable energy sources and spend high amounts of their income on electricity costs. And when this happens, it results into energy poverty. Eliminating energy poverty is a goal I think we're all interested in achieving and working towards that goal. But we need mindful and policies that will impact the communities that we're trying to serve. When the government creates policies, its first priority should be the welfare of the people. And with the uncertainty that comes with this virus, it would not be prudent to eliminate safe and reliable energy sources like oil and natural gas for unproven and unreliable renewable sources. Certainly not right now. Chairman, your bill's attempt to bring environmental justice to underserved and vulnerable communities, I get that. It's a great idea. But purposely shutting down the oil and gas industry is not the way to do it. Higher electricity prices and diminished access to affordable energy sources are the last things these communities need. Renewable energy mandates and natural gas bans like those enacted in California for new buildings would make access to affordable housing even more challenging than it already is. An article published this month by NBC Channel 4 Los Angeles regarding affordable housing to be built by taxpayer dollars is now costing the city over $500,000 and as high as $740,000 per unit due to regulations. If we want to help eliminate energy poverty, we should make federal energy projects easier to build, not more difficult. Chairman, your bill would tie federal projects up so tight in red tape, low-cost sources of energy like natural gas would never even make it to the communities that your bill is attempting to help. A bill introduced this morning by Congressman Hearn is a step in the right direction. By trying to determine what kinds of policies are actually helpful for people suffering from energy poverty, which policies are hurtful, and directing federal agencies and Congress to help them come up with real workable solutions to help improve their lives. My grandfather was a black coal miner in Southwest Virginia, and I worked as a brakeman for Norfolk Southern, loading coal ships that transported coal all around the world. I believe in America's energy, and we all should. And you say, why? Why? Well, currently the United States is the #1 leader in exporting oil and natural gas. How can our natural resources be worthy enough for the rest of the world to use, but not good enough for us right here at home? We need to find ways that can actually help vulnerable communities and not just say we're helping them. Americans are struggling right now due to COVID, and imposing more regulations and shutting down oil and gas just does not make sense. The industry employs many of the same people in those communities your bill claims to help, Mr. Chairman, and eliminating those jobs and the way of life is not going to help them. One example of a project that could have benefited an EJ, environmental justice community, was canceled due to an onslaught of litigation and misleading information is the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. The ACP proposed to transport cheap, clean-burning American natural gas across West Virginia, and North Carolina, creating about 17,000 well-paying union jobs and about $2.7 billion worth of economic activity in the process. The project was also expected to generate about $4.2 million in local tax revenue every single year for communities along the route. And one of those communities was Union Hill, Virginia, in Buckingham County. And it was treated like an EJ community during the process. However, the result was devastating for Buckingham County and the surrounding areas because they lost the pipeline. The proposal calls for a compressor station to be built right there in Buckingham County that would connect an already existing Transco pipeline, which runs through the county already. Besides the jobs and revenue, there was much more to come, including $5 million towards projects that include a new recreation center, a new health clinic, and a fully funded year-round fire station. I attended several of those hearings for the ACP pipeline, an initial hearing in Buckingham County. And there were about 250 people in attendance that included maybe 8 or 9 Black people, including myself. And during the hearing, the term environmental racism kept being used repeatedly. But unfortunately, that term kept coming from white people claiming to help Black people in that community. I understand the need and the want to shift towards renewable energy. However, given the current global situation and what's going on in this country right now and all the unknowns, the shift must be done sensibly and gradually. Thank you for your time. I yield back and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Now let me introduce our next witness, Dr. Mildred McLean, co-founded and is currently serves as executive director of the Harmby House Citizens for Environmental Justice, a community-based organization whose mission is to build the capacity of communities to solve their problems and to engage in positive growth and development. Dr. McLean has been a human rights activist and teacher for over 40 years. She created major partnerships with the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency for Toxic Substances, and the Disease Registry, the Centers for Disease Control, and many community-based organizations with the goal of addressing public health and environmental justice issues and concerns. Dr. McLean served as a delegate to the World Conference Against Racism and the World Summit on Sustainable Development, both held in South Africa. Welcome, Dr. McLean, and the 5 minutes are yours.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so very much for the invitation to speak to you this morning. I definitely want to pay my gratitude to Chairman Grijalva as well as Representative McEachin for their tireless work on this bill. And I want to say from the onset that it was a true representation of what democracy can look like. This bill was vetted to many communities, neighborhoods, environmental justice leaders, business industry to have their input, so that indeed a bill put before Congress would reflect the communities of America, not just environmental injustice or environmental justice communities, but American communities in specific and in general. As I said, thank you so much for inviting me to testify today. My name is Dr. Mildred McLean, and I am the Executive Director of the Harambe House and Citizens for Environmental Justice, located in Savannah, Georgia, on the beautiful coast. We are a community-based organization that works collectively with families, youth, businesses, industries, government, academia, and other organizations in our neighborhoods and across this country. Since 1990, we have aimed at educating, inspiring, organizing, and building the capacity of African Americans and other communities of color to create and sustain safe, economically vibrant, healthy neighborhoods, and that promote healthy living, wellness, and environmental justice for both frontline and fence line communities like ours that have historically suffered the effects of disproportionate exposure to toxins and pollutants. The Environmental Justice for All Act is a promising start to long overdue legislation aimed at addressing systemic environmental injustices resulting from federal decisions. For far too long, environmental justice communities have suffered the burdens of exposure to multiple sources of pollution, including alarming high rates of respiratory illnesses, cancer, and premature death. Rightly, this bill attempts to address this problem by investing in local communities, increasing transparency, and empowering impacted stakeholders to hold polluters accountable. The process by which this bill was developed deserves particular attention. This bill was developed from the ground up, as I said earlier, and it shows how we can together work to come up with workable solutions. The importance of this process is reflected in the bill's emphasis on strengthening one of the only laws that gives communities a voice, the National Environmental Policy Act. There are many important pieces to this bill which we support, but I want to speak directly to the critical importance of NEPA in ensuring better environmental justice outcomes. The Harambe House and Citizens for Environmental Justice in its early inception were able to use NEPA to engage citizens and residents with the Department of Energy, as well as the Savannah River plant on activities that were going on at the facility. We began our engagement after 20,000 picocuries of tritium found its way down to the Savannah River in 1991. My time is about up, and so I just want to say, NEPA calls for citizen involvement in any type of federal decision-making process that may have impact on the environment, the ecology, the economy, the culture, and the health and the ways of people. NEPA has been a tool for us, and this bill reinforces what NEPA has tried to do and what the current administration is trying to roll back. It is important that the voices of communities such as my own can have a fair say in what happens in their community. There are always two sides to every story, but this bill allows our story to be heard and allows our power to be one of those powers that say we must have environmental justice for all Americans. I yield back.
To continue to do and have been doing. Andrea Vidaurre is the co-founder of the People's Collective for Environmental Justice. Andrea was born and raised in the Inland Empire of Southern California. She has lived at the intersections of multiple issues and barriers, which led her to engage in the work that advances her community's quality of life. At the University of California, Riverside, she graduated with a BA in Global Studies. Upon graduating, she began working for the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice, where for 2 years she worked on land use, air quality, transportation, and climate policy through the building of a community and coalition power. She is She's a co-founder of the People's Collective for Environmental Justice, an emerging organization centered in organizing for environmental and social justice and for the advancement of protective policies and programs that improve the quality of life in the Inland Empire. With that, Andrea, let me turn to you, and the time is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Chairman Grijalva, members of the committee. My name is Andrea Vidaurre, co-founder and member of the People's Collective for Environmental Justice. We're a collective of residents organizing to fight for a better quality of life here in our neighborhoods of the Inland Empire of California. The Environmental Justice for All Act addresses many of the obstacles that our communities and others like ours battle every day. Our region is known by some as the shopping cart of America because it is likely that the Amazon products that you find in your retail stores were through my community. The Inland Empire is about an hour east of two of the largest ports in the world, the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, moving about 40% of the nation's goods. Because of this, communities, predominantly Black, Indigenous, and people of color, are seeing the landscape transform and turn into profitable sacrifice zones for some of the wealthiest companies in the world. Retail giants like Amazon and Walmart, automobile companies, the Class 1 railroads like BNSF and Union Pacific all set up their logistics shops here, making it possible for them to reap record benefits even during a pandemic. Here, on average, thousands of trucks drive by our homes, schools, community spaces every day. And the protections that would safeguard our health from these impacts just don't exist, which have obvious consequences for the communities that are forced to live with these injustices. San Bernardino and Riverside County are ranked as the first ozone pollution in the nation. Health studies show that the underdevelopment of lung capacity, childhood asthma, and other illnesses are normal here because of the environment. To the point that these consequences have prematurely taken loved ones from our families. We're forced to normalize a toxic environment because our families and other loved ones are dependent on this extractive economy to survive and protect their families. The logistics industry in particular also creates problems for families like mine that are in the workforce. The industry has rampant wage theft, misclassifies workers, creates unsafe working conditions, and is not preparing for a transition. In our region, where Amazon is the top private employer and logistics is a leading industry, only 4 out of 10 jobs actually pay a living wage. So we're calling for real solutions that create environmental justice legislation rooted in civil rights gains that protect vulnerable communities and workers, and remove the barriers to opportunities and resources like there's no reason that a system to be unsustainable and hurt communities of color that can't provide thriving wages when an industry has seen so much profit, and why they can't transition into an energy usage that stops the expansion of what we call diesel death zones. Because of this slow environmental violence that exists day to day, that has generational impacts outside of our health. Environmental racism impacts social mobility, generational wealth, takes a toll on our safety nets and our healthcare systems, and it worsens the future of the climate crisis. So we need policy that ensures permitting decisions fully reflect on-the-ground realities and cumulative impacts. If we do not look at the relationship between each development project, we're not going to understand the bigger picture. Here, warehouses have been built as close as 70 feet from people's homes, all while right next to it, you're building a 3 million square foot warehouse, all while the region is battling against a 4 million square foot, which would be approximately 700 size, bringing in 10,000 trucks a day on top of the already trucks that are here. Vast environmental and racial injustice is a product of ignoring cumulative impacts. Second, I want to point out that our communities are given little to no time when these upcoming projects are proposed. Locally, we had to find out about the expansion of the San Bernardino Airport for Amazon's air cargo hub through a newspaper article. It took a group of community members, leaders, labor organizations to get involved and inform the neighborhood of this project. Transparency is supposed to be a key for establishing a healthy relationship with the public, but we're given very little of that, especially when the project is going to bring in harm. Third, I want to say that community groups on the ground and in direct contact with the public need the resources and support to provide the tools, materials, guidance to address these environmental concerns. The resources that are currently available are too cumbersome to access. the increasing upfront costs, start costs, and complex applications. So overall, the Environmental Justice for All Act must continue to center environmental justice communities because it's overdue and democratic. Environmental racism has impacted Black and Indigenous communities of colors for decades, as I explained just from my experience on its own. And this bill is a collective step to repairing some of that undue harm and hardship. So we look forward to seeing the great impact that it's going to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now introduce distinguished gentleman, Dr. Robert D. Bullard. He's often described as the father of environmental justice. He is the former dean of the Barbara Jordan McLean School of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University. Professor Bullard currently is a distinguished professor of urban planning and environmental policy. And prior to coming to TSU, he was the founding director of the Environmental Justice Resource Center at Clark Atlanta University. He received his PhD degree from Iowa State University. He's an award-winning author of 18 books that address sustainable development, environmental racism, urban land use and industrial facility siting and community reinvestment, housing, transportation, climate justice, and community resilience, smart growth, and regional equity. He is the co-founder of the HBCU Climate Change Consortium. Dr. Bullard is a proud U.S. Marine Corps veteran. He was featured in the July 2007 CNN People You Should Know. Bullard, and the title of it was Green Issue is Black and White. Dr. Bullard, good to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Greetings.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. My name is Dr. Robert Bullard, and I'm a distinguished professor of urban planning and environmental policy at Texas Southern University in Houston. And I also co-chair the National Black Environmental Justice Network. I want to state for the record why H.R. 5986, the Environmental Justice Act for All, is needed and why I support its passage. For the past 4 decades, I've written more than a dozen books and assisted scores of low-income people and communities in the U.S. that are disproportionately impacted by environmental health threats. I wrote Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and Environmental Quality in 1990, 30 years ago, that documented the connection between race, income, place, and pollution. The National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, 9 years later, after Dumping in Dixie in 1999, found residents in environmental justice communities are exposed to higher levels of pollution than the rest of the nation and experience certain diseases in greater number, unquote. Zip code is a potent predictor of health and well-being in the U.S. All communities and all zip codes are not created equal. If a community happens to be poor, inhabited largely by people of color, or physically located on the wrong side of the tracks, levee, river, or highway, it's likely to receive less protection. People of color are overrepresented in populations who live near the nation's 1,300 Superfund sites. Recent studies now show 60% of the nation's Superfund sites are threatened by flooding and climate change impacts. A 2018 EPA study found in 46 states, people of color live with more air pollution than whites. People of color breathe 38% more polluted air than whites. More pollution translates into more illnesses and more deaths. African Americans and Latino children are 3 to 5 times more likely than white children to be hospitalized from asthma. African American children have a death rate that's 10 times that of white children. The passage of the Environmental Justice Act for All will go a long way in remedying many environmental health burdens that fall heaviest on low-income and people of color communities. We need the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI, strengthened to prohibit discrimination, including discrimination in siting, permitting, provision of services, and funding. Generally, low-income communities and people of color communities are not confronted with one threat at a time. Usually, we're talking about multiple environmental threats. The time is long overdue to require cumulative impact consideration in permitting decisions under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. We need the Environmental Justice Executive Order signed by President Clinton in 1994 to be codified, updated, strengthened, and yes, fully implemented. Environmental justice communities need a stronger, not weaker NEPA. Environmental justice and health equity grants programs are needed to investigate links between chemicals and adverse health impacts, whether chemical emissions from smokestacks or toxic chemicals in consumer products. Grants are needed to ensure more equitable access to parks and recreational opportunities for underserved communities. Grants to support research, education, outreach, development, and implementation of projects to address environment and health inequities in low-income and communities of color. Finally, as the nation moves to a clean energy economy, it's important that this new economy is not built on existing inequality. Thus, a fair and just transition is needed to support communities and workers, especially low-wage workers and workers of color who have historically, over the many years, been left behind by economic transitions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony and reminding members that we have that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on the questions by the members. And I'd like to start that part of our meeting and our hearing by turning to my colleague and co-lead on the Environmental Justice for All Act, Representative McEachin, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and thank you for your leadership and allowing me to work with you on this cause of trying to make sure that we bring environmental justice to all Americans. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to depart from my prepared remarks just for a moment because I have to comment that I am somewhat stunned and surprised by the comments from the other side of the aisle about our bill. As has been noted, our bill actually went to the folks who are affected by environmental injustice and said to them, what is it that you need? How can we empower you? You and I, together with the environmental justice communities, Mr. Chairman, rejected the traditional DC way of imposing our will on folks. And instead, we're trying to work this from the bottom up. And I'm proud of the bill that we've managed to put together. We didn't write it. It was written by the people and for the people. And I'm proud of the people that wrote this bill. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I would now turn to my questions. And the question really is for starting off with Dr. Bullard. Sir, have you personally experienced any adverse health impacts that you believe are associated with the effects of environmental injustice? And can you share a short snapshot of how that might impact one's daily life?
Thank you for your question. Let me say that I have not personally had any physical interaction with environmental health impacts, but I've been in many communities and worked with many communities that suffered from environmental injustice and environmental health disparities and being dumped on. I don't know if I've been affected. I don't think I've been affected by, over the last 40 years, traveling to these communities, working in these communities, and in some cases breathing the same air. But I can say I have witnessed firsthand, up close and personal, and have worked as as a researcher, as an expert witness and testified and basically documented that environmental health disparities are real. The impacts of living next to the fence line, it's real. Whether it's children that are going to school across the fence from a chemical plant, a refinery, or a park that's across the street from a refinery, and looking at the health outcomes in that community with elevated asthma, with other respiratory illnesses, with cancer, with diabetes. You start naming all the things that go into creating the elevated multiple risk scape, and you can see, and we've documented this over the last 40 years. And so that's how I have been able to see up close, and since I've seen up close, I've tried to work with those communities directly.
I'd like to
Thank you,
respond
Doctor.
to that.
Dr. McLean, same question, ma'am.
Yes, well, let me start off by saying that many of my family members have suffered from health effects from living in toxic areas. My mom died at an early age, 75. My grandson is suffering from asthma. My nephew lives in Hudson Hill, here in Savannah, that is surrounded by 17 industries and at the mouth of the port. Many of his friends have asthma. I myself, at the age of 17, was diagnosed with a disease that I'm not going to repeat, and it was from drinking milk from cows that had been impacted by some of the radiation stuff from the nuclear weapons production sites. And so not only have my family been impacted, but close friends have family members. And we work here with the environmental injustice communities in Savannah. And every time we have a charrette or a meeting or a workshop or a training, these residents raise the issue of health impacts from living in that industrial corridor. We are not Cancer Alley, but we can definitely be Cancer Hallway. The reason why the west side of Savannah communities came to the Harambe House was because of the unusual health impacts that they were noting, and no one would go to their aid. It was through the use of NEPA that we were able to get in there at the decision-making table, raise these issues about the regular people being impacted. And I want to commend you on this process, because community people are subject matter experts because we live it every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And to Ms. Vidaurre, I apologize to you, ma'am. I was going to ask that question of you, but I have overrun my time. And so, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ranking Member Gosar, time is yours. Mr. Gosar?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go to Garrett Graves first and then Mr. Harm before me.
Mr. Graves, 5 minutes. Time is yours, sir.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for having this hearing, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to take a look at this legislation. Dr. Bullard, thank you for being here today. I want to ask Texas Southern, with Hurricane Harvey, I understand that the Rod Page Education Building, that your library and the E.O. Bell Building were all flooded in addition to other damages. Were you personally impacted by Hurricane Harvey?
Yes, sir. I had to evacuate. For 5 days, I was away from my home. And when I came back, the water didn't come inside. It came up to the driveway. I was lucky. I'm one of the lucky ones.
Well, I'm glad you and your family made it out safe. I saw some of the destruction in the rainfall. That was extraordinary. And I'm glad, again, that y'all made it out okay. But I also just continue to offer our prayers to many of your community members in the Houston area that were just so impacted. If I recall, 36 inches of rain in some areas. I mean, I don't even know where you put that much water. That's incredible. Dr. Bullard, Congressman Cedric Richmond, a friend of mine who represents the New Orleans area, often reminds us that that much of the Gulf Coast, we have a disproportionately African-American community compared to the rest of the nation, meaning we have a higher percentage of African-Americans in Louisiana, nearly a third of our state. Alabama's nearly a quarter. Mississippi's, I believe, 38%, for example. And when we were working on funding allocations from energy resources to go back into those Gulf states. There's a disparity, or what I would call discrimination, in that you have states that have energy production onshore federal lands, and they get 50% of the money. But then for the Gulf Coast states like ours, we only get, in recent years, it's been less than 1%. In some years, it's been, I think, 4% in other years. And these funds are used to go back into hurricane protection and coastal restoration and other things. And so he has expressed much frustration about the disparity or the discrimination against the Gulf states. Would you agree that that just doesn't seem fair if some states get 50% and if your state, my state gets 1% or 4%?
Let me say this for the record. Any form of discrimination is unfair. And if you look at, as you move from 30,000 feet, because I think that's what you're looking at, 30,000 feet, as you look, zero in on ground level zero, on the fence line, the communities that are closest to the fence line and that are hosting many of the oil and gas facilities, you can see a great disparity there. The people who live closest are least likely to get the jobs, are least likely to benefit directly from the taxes that generate and flow to the parish, in the case of Louisiana, because the tax dollars are actually flow generally, and the benefits are more dispersed, whereas the externalities, the costs are much more localized.
You know, in our state, actually, some of the numbers that I've seen show that the folks proximate to those facilities actually are the ones who have the jobs. But I'm talking about the offshore, and I just want to reiterate what you said, and that anytime you have a disparity like that, that's the definition of discrimination. Congressman Richmond reminds me that Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana are at the bottom in regard to healthcare, education, economy, infrastructure, opportunity, fiscal stability, crime and corrections, and natural environment. What this bill that we're talking about today actually takes what is already a discriminatory approach that many people in this committee have just continued to support. They've continued to support the discrimination. They voted against equity. This bill actually takes it a step further because it actually takes money, it further cuts the money that's given to your state, that's given to my state, Mississippi, Alabama, and benefits Florida as well. It takes money that goes to those states for hurricane protection and coastal restoration, therefore making our very communities even more vulnerable than they are today. And it just seems so crazy to me that here we are talking about discrimination, racial injustice, and the bill that we're talking about actually makes it worse. I just want to know what anybody who supports this bill would say to the Hurricane Harvey victims, the Hurricane Sally victims that are still digging out, the Hurricane Laura victims in Louisiana right now. What would you say to them that you're pouring salt in the wound they're trying to dig out right now, saying you're taking more money for them to flood them even worse and cause even worse environmental impacts? Who does that?
Well, if I may ask, or I don't know if you asked him that question.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Is that a question?
Was it rhetorical or was that a question?
Absolutely. I'd love to hear your response. I don't know how people can do this with good conscience. This is crazy. 30 people.
Bob, please speak to that.
Let me just say.
Please, sir. Answer this question. I think time's almost up.
Okay, let me just say that there's so many layers of discrimination that occurs in the states that you're talking about that has nothing to do with oil and gas per se. The reason why the southern states are poor, they lead the nation in bad health outcomes. They lead the nation in other kinds of education outcomes. And again, the disparities that we're talking about build off of many of the policies that are more systemic in the way that resources get distributed, and health gets distributed, and land uses get distributed. So when you talk about all these things, it's more than just one item of oil and gas.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. I want to thank you, Dr. Bullard, for your answers and response, and just make note that these are the revenues that we actually use to fund our healthcare and our environments and other infrastructure in Louisiana that this very bill and this committee is trying to take. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Huffman, 5 minutes of yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Representative McEachin. Really appreciate your leadership in bringing forward this important legislation. The reality is no one in this country is feeling the current deadly pandemic more than communities of color and tribes. They were already facing a whole bunch of environmental health and other disparities due to historic and ongoing injustices. And the longer this pandemic festers or is ignored and wished away by the pandemic deniers, the more these disparities are amplified. So this legislation, I think, gets it right by working to address the problem instead of wishing it away, or as our friends across the aisle would suggest, pretending that the only answer is to double down on fossil fuels, to do even more of the thing that has created some of the worst EJ problems, which increasingly include climate change impacts, which our colleagues still can't bring themselves to fully acknowledge. Mr. Hawley, our addiction to fossil fuels is literally killing us. And as our witnesses, other witnesses have testified, communities of color are bearing the worst impacts of that. Arguing that the only answer is to keep making fossil fuels cheaper and more abundant is like the heroin addict who thinks finding cheaper heroin is the only way to afford buying groceries and paying the rent. We have got to start thinking outside of the fossil fuel box. And we need to stop repeating historic injustices. So for centuries, we know development and progress in America came at the expense of Native peoples. And it's important to know that that is still happening. In my district, the Klamath River and the people who depend on it are running out of time. We've got 4 aging dams on the Klamath River, and we have witnessed some of the worst salmon runs ever because of the impacts of those dams. Tribal elders have watched the lifeblood of their people vanish. Native children are growing up without even knowing this central piece of their culture and heritage. And downstream coastal communities are hurting as commercial fishing becomes more and more constrained by the impacts of these aging dams. Now, these were originally sited without any meaningful input from tribes and downstream communities. And now there's a delay in removing them. And it's just one more example of the injustices that indigenous communities continue to face. It is no different than the siting decisions we see for uranium mines or refineries or major highways. Local vulnerable communities need a seat at the table and they need to be heard. So I want to thank the chairman and vice chairman Holland and subcommittee chair Gallego for their support for justice for the tribes negatively impacted by the Klamath dams. And I'm really pleased that this bill before us strengthens the tribal role in the NEPA process. This is something I've heard about from tribes in my district, that government to government consultation on NEPA is important, especially when federal actions impact their reservation lands and sacred sites. As the Trump administration tries to gut NEPA, this bill gets it right by strengthening NEPA to give tribes and frontline communities a meaningful voice, a step at the table to help achieve environmental justice. So, Dr. McLean, I just want to ask you, you talked about this, why strengthening NEPA is the key to better outcomes. Can you give some additional examples of how NEPA requirements have allowed communities to become more involved and empowered in the public process?
Yes, the NEPA process guarantees a seat at the table for all stakeholders. Here in Savannah, when they were getting ready to widen our port, our river, to accommodate larger ships coming out of the Panama Canal, it was the NEPA requirements that allowed the residents of Hudson Hill, Bayview, Clearview, Greater West Savannah, and Woodville to actually participate in all of the different components of the environmental impact statement process. Without NEPA, we would not have had a seat at the table. Now, when we look at going back some time, the residents of both Georgia and South Carolina used NEPA to insinuate themselves into several things that were being proposed at the site. The disposition of the 50 metric tons of surplus weapons grade plutonium, the receipt of 15,000 spent nuclear fuel rods from Europe coming back to the Savannah River site, as well as the waste isolation pilot project. It was NEPA who allowed us, who gave us the right and the authority to be able to participate. The Environmental Justice for All bill strengthens, it actually strengthens the different pieces in NEPA. And Section 14 in particular provides for protections for environmental justice communities against the harmful federal actions. So we love NEPA. I used to be the NEPA ninja, and that was a person who went around to vulnerable communities who have been disproportionately impacted by environmental issues to teach them how to use that tool. And that tool actually allowed us to build a partnership with the Savannah River site, with the Department of Energy, as well as the Department of Defense. It was a tool that is now being lifted up in this bill, and we think that it is time for it, and we support it to the hilt.
Well, thank you for being such a great NEPA ninja and for all your leadership. I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Mr. Gosar, who was the, you indicated a sequence, Mr. Graves and then someone else? I'm sorry, I forgot.
Mr. Hearn.
Sure. Floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Gosar, and our witnesses for being here today. I'm especially happy to see Mr. Hawley back before the committee this morning or this afternoon. Hope that he can add some to his extremely compelling testimony from February of last year, 2019, where he urged to address energy poverty by increasing access to affordable energy for minority communities. Mr. Chairman, as you may be aware, earlier this morning, I introduced the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act with 10 of my Republican colleagues. This legislation was based on the recommendations that Mr. Hawley gave to us last year and would direct the Department of Interior, the Forest Service, the CBO, the GAO, and the OMB to help determine how to alleviate energy poverty in at-risk communities and whether federal policies will exacerbate energy poverty. On the other hand, the bill before us today, the Environmental Justice for All Act, is an extremely duplicative piece of legislation that would delay new energy infrastructure projects by drawing out the already lengthy NEPA process, cause extreme and unnecessary job losses from the implementation of needless fees on energy development, and open the door to a flood of legal challenges to line the pockets of trial lawyers, my Democrats colleagues, good friends. Like the chairman's bill, the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act will be extremely beneficial to our most vulnerable communities. This is because it will ensure that the needs of the vulnerable communities are met before my colleagues across the aisle impose mandates to eviscerate their energy accessibility. My question to you, Mr. Hawley, is I'd like to say first, thank you for being the impetus and the idea behind the legislation that I introduced today. And thank you for your kind words in your testimony. With my colleagues aiming to impose radical policies like the Green New Deal, we need legislation like this to ensure that they do not overlook the drastic effects that their ideas could have on energy poverty. As the president of Reaching America, you have a great deal of experience with complex social issues like energy poverty, so I'd like you to expand on this for the committee. And so my question is, can you explain the need to fully understand the policy implications of legislation before imposing them on vulnerable communities and potentially minimizing their access to affordable energy? Mr. Hawley, I think you're still muted.
I think I'm good now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that. And energy poverty is an issue I've been working on for the past several years now. And I had the opportunity to speak to thousands of people in several states, all of them down the East Coast and the Gulf states, who, you know, they talk about the need for energy, and they talk about the extreme costs that they have to pay every single month. And think about it as energy as I've been doing this over the years, people often say, Derek, the energy poverty issue is not a sexy subject. It's not something that everyone talks about because people really don't even think about their energy until they need to turn on, you need to click on a light switch, or you go click on that switch for your natural gas fireplace. Then it comes into play that these are natural resources that we. But what I've come to find out with these people, I don't dispute a lot of things that people are talking about on the other side when it comes to some of the vulnerabilities of these communities in terms of what happened in the past. But right now, the technology that we have, like carbon sequestration and other technology they have with energy, those problems, they don't still exist in these communities. And so I look at some of the stuff down here in Maryland. There's a plant here in Maryland. You know what, Congressman, that plant should have been closed. But as we move ahead and look at the technology we have today, we need to utilize resources we have in this country. Again, I go back to what I said earlier, and that is the United States is the #1 exporter of oil and natural gas to the world. The rest of the world utilizes our resources. How is it that our resources are good enough for other countries, but not good enough for us right here at home? That makes no sense to me. And so while we develop our energy, we need to be mindful that we do it safely and take into consideration the people living in these areas and make sure that they are protected at the same time, and that we are in fact good stewards of the environment. I'm a licensed captain. I'm all about protecting this environment. So I would not in any way step here and try to portray or push fossil fuels if I didn't believe in myself. You talk about different areas across the country, when you eliminate these jobs, these fossil fuel jobs, like in Appalachia, where my grandfather was a black coal miner. I had an opportunity to go back there a couple of years ago. These people have never, ever been rebounded yet from the loss of these jobs. And we talk about poverty in Appalachia, it doesn't compare to what you see in the urban areas. In urban cities, you get your WIC card, you go down to the store and get you something to eat. These people in the urban Appalachia, they can't just walk to the store. They don't have access to different resources. A lot of people, their rooms are so damaged right now that they can't even fix them.
Mr. Hawley, I'm going to have to, I know we'd all, I can see some, no, I appreciate your passion. I know some of my colleagues across the aisle must agree with you because they're smiling a lot. But I appreciate your passion and your impetus for getting this bill put out there. And for all my colleagues across the aisle, I know all of you are dying to see the text on this. I have a copy of this for all of you that are not in this room that would like to have one. We'll have one delivered to your office or emailed to you quickly so that you can read it. But as a person who's an all-above energy guy, I think we need to look at this as something, how we look at how it impacts our communities, and we don't create a hardship on them as we're trying to do things. I know we have many discussions in this area. This is an opportunity for us to use our research folks to actually look at this within a year after implementing policy. Thank you all so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And Mr. Chairman, I assume we're going to bill the oil and gas industry for all the extra time we've been allowing for each of the last couple witnesses.
Thank you. Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have some questions in regard to the funding for the bill. Where's the bill coming from? Because it was stated that it would take from other needed areas. And then when you talk about the impacted communities, there is usually not enough information given to them or training for them to recognize that it's an impact on them. So that would be something that needs to be addressed if it hasn't already. I know in my community, especially in Ms. Vidaurre's area, and which is, I'm in LA County, I have to get people involved and try to teach them what it is that they're facing in their own backyard. We still have a battery recharging and recycling center that is wanting to expand. It's right in the middle of an area that is surrounded by residential, and they are having health problems. We can't, they want to expand it, and we say no, because it's already impacting the local community. There's cancer, there's all kinds of other things happening. So that's something that is important the other area is elected officials. If the elected officials aren't listening to them, we should train people to run, to fight for and be more cognizant of what the needs are of a community. And I also, the last point would be to ask anybody if there's an impact on mental health in all of these areas. Anybody? No, I guess not. It should have, it does have an impact, because when they get sick, they are impacted mentally. They can't work, they lose their jobs, or they're sick, or the families are not able to provide for the lost income. You talk about NEPA, that Mr. Bullard, the executive order 12898, it has to be codified. Would you explain a little further on that?
Yes, the executive order that was signed by President Clinton in '94 is basically composed of two pieces of existing legislation: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI, and the National Environmental Policy Act. And in a lot of the workings with the various agencies, the federal agencies and the state agencies, it's been very difficult to get positive change, because there is no environmental justice law that you can point to talk about forcing agencies to address environmental justice, build it into their plans and programs, their strategies. So what we're saying is that if we had the executive order as it exists, with the various elements that brings into Title VI and NEPA, it would be much more, it would be easier. The public participation, the community information access, etc. And the idea that even having the executive order for 26 years or so, it has never been implemented fully. Fully implemented. And so because of that, and because having an executive order is not as good as having a law, because any president that comes in can actually rescind it. So it's better to have a law than just an executive order.
Thank you
Hope I answered
very
your
much.
question.
Yes, it does. Also, when the tribes and other communities of color, maybe the information doesn't go out in the media. The media plays a strong part in this, in that it would be their responsibility to alert people in the area, but sometimes that doesn't make it in the media because it is not sexy, it doesn't sell, or it's not, there is something else that's going on that's more timely. So somehow the media needs to be held accountable for not alerting the public of something that's going on in the background. Mr. Chair, I will submit the questions for the record, and thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Napolitano. Let me now turn, Mr. Gosar. Mr. Gosar?
I go to Mr. Gomer first.
Mr. Gomer, you have 5 minutes. Mr. Gomer, you're recognized for 5 minutes. I think Mr. Gomer is muted. Somebody should alert him to that.
I don't see Gilbert on here.
He's not logged in.
Bill that.
Well, there he is. There he is.
I'm a co-sponsor, and Mr. Byer has.
Somebody yelled at the
Yeah. Yes, it's 100% on
Plugged in. His camera's not on.
I gotta know what they are.
Mr. Gosar, is there another person until Mr. Comer gets his thing together?
I'm gonna leave.
Well, I guess I'll just go.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar.
Well, first of all, I couldn't miss it, but to my friend from California, Mr. Huffman, I think what we need to do is get you over to Arizona to look at what the tribal aspects have been empowered to do because of streamlining and by prioritizing their healthy forest initiatives. In my time in Arizona, I've overseen the largest wildfire in Arizona history, the Wallow Fire, in which the only way we got containment was that the fire burned right up to the White Mountain Apache, where they actually had done proper forest management. And that actually allowed resources to circle the fire and get it put out. So once again, streamlining of the process actually works. And entities that are empowered by streamlining, when they're held accountable, actually get us the best results. Now, and then let's just take it a step further. You know, when we're talking about environmental justice, why is it that on our Pluria bill, the Forest Service was pulled in their siding? Shouldn't that be all part of the process to make sure that all entities are pertaining that could ante up for alternative energy sites be put in the can to look at what sites are available? There's another aspect that we ought to be looking at environmental justice. Mr. Hawley, proponents of Chairman Grijalva's bill, including some of the other witnesses you've heard today, speak highly of its attempts to engage with local communities and make sure that their involvement is meaningful. To your understanding, doesn't the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, already allow for public engagement and comment at multiple stages of the review process?
It does. That's why I'm so confused by people asking and saying that it needs to be strengthened.
Well, and I gave a very good example of the tribes in Arizona, particularly that we streamline the process and then give them prioritization and incentivize them to be able to take part in management of their forests. That seems like a pretty open and closed case, does it not?
Yes, sir, it does.
So now a lot of the testimony from other witnesses have focused on the issue of public health, particularly the assumed negative health impacts of conventional energy development. Isn't it true that the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and multiple other state and federal regulations protect against these impacts already?
Yes, sir. And as I testified back in February, right now, the air is the cleanest it's been in 20 years.
Well, and I find it very interesting that we have these catastrophic wildfires that put more pollutants in one day than it does a year of carbon emissions from cars and trucks, particularly heavy metals, because trees are seines. They actually pull up heavy metals and stuff in the trees, and when they burn or explode, they are put into the atmosphere. So it seems to me like we ought to be empowering more tribes to do more work on more public lands, to get them under attention so that we don't have these big carbon and disastrous fires. Don't you think?
I would agree. Yes, sir.
And that would
Yes,
have a big impact on those with asthma and respiratory diseases, like the predilection to COVID, would it not?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I wonder. So now, if the negative health impacts are indeed felt or feared in at-risk communities' conventional energy development, what do you think would be some of the avenues to address these issues that do not cripple energy access or create unattainable electricity costs?
We just need to continue to develop energy safely and making sure that we are taking into account these vulnerable communities. And again, we've been doing it safely over the last few years. I think we can continue to do that.
Well, once again, I'm going to point to Arizona, where we have an energy company that actually uses solar during the day and natural gas at night, giving us that benefit of having alternative energy that's intermittent, but having that baseload backup that actually works. And it's one of the cheapest mechanisms for megawatt energy out there. Do you think that's a kind of common sense application that we're talking about, utilizing all the above benefits of energy?
Yes, sir. And I believe that we should have an all-above approach, do what makes sense.
So now Chairman Grijalva's bill requires a community impact report for each and every major federal action, including renewable energy projects. A community impact report requires a federal agency to assess potential community public health and environmental hazards to environmental justice communities, even though this is already addressed underneath the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. What do you think the impact of this requirement will be in terms of expanding access to affordable energy? And number two, what do you anticipate in terms of potential litigation?
I think it would drive up the cost of energy, to answer the first question. And then I think long drawn out litigations it would only take away from these communities and the people who need this affordable, reliable energy the most.
One last question, Mr. Chairman. Don't you think that when we look at streamlining the process, that we engage more at the local level with remedies that they see fit? I mean, I'm a doctor from a previous lifetime, and what I was always taught is that when you have a patient, shut your mouth, listen to what the problem is, and then listen carefully, because I'll tell you the solution as well. So I believe that we need to go back to the local level and empower communities to solve these issues, and have the federal government be the circulator of these great ideas, because that was what the magic of America was I can make myself better, I have opportunity and engagement for the future, to infinity and beyond, as Buzz Lightyear would say.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We need to speak with the people.
Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Let me now turn to our colleague, Ms. Velasquez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking member. Dr. Bullard, a new study from Harvard University shows that people with COVID-19 who live in regions with high levels of air pollution are more likely to die from the virus than individuals living in less polluted areas. But despite these challenges, these findings, the Trump administration continues reversing important environmental rules, many of which will weaken our emissions guidelines and increase air pollution. So given the study's finding, can you explain how President Trump is failing to protect clean air and compromising the health of frontline communities, particularly those of color?
If we look at the impact of the Clean Air Act in terms of enforcement, and for the last 30 years, the air has been getting cleaner. But from 2016 to 2018, we had a drop in terms of air quality. If we look at the whole idea of the impact of air quality, and particularly pollution and particulate matter, PM 2.10, PM 10 and PM 2.5, and particularly the fine particles. The Harvard study, and there are a number of other studies now that are showing that COVID-19 is acting like a heat-seeking missile that's zeroing in on communities that have the highest levels of pollution, particularly PM. And when you look at and we've mapped out before COVID, the communities that had the highest levels of pollution and the highest levels of respiratory illnesses like asthma, these are the hot spots that COVID is hitting hardest. And so there is a responsibility. If we don't get COVID under control, then it means more illnesses, more infections, and more deaths. So the idea of responsibility in terms of the kinds of rollbacks in environmental protection, whether it's, as I said, whether it's the Clean Air Act, weakening the protection, or waiving those rules, it creates problems for those vulnerable communities.
Thank you. And Dr. Bullard, due to these unprecedented times, we have the opportunity for economic restructuring that incentivizes clean energy jobs. As we work towards reopening our economy, what role do these jobs play in improving public health and labor productivity? And how can we guarantee that job training and opportunities are given to communities most impacted by environmental injustice?
I think it's important as we transition, as we address economic development and job creation. I think it's important that we underscore the fact that historically workers of color have been left behind. They were left behind in the fossil fuel dominated economy. There has not been an economic renaissance brought to the Gulf Coast states. like Louisiana. Louisiana has one of the highest poverty rates in the country. It has one of the highest unhealthy citizenry in the country. So we have to make sure that as we transition, that we make sure that we talk about green, clean, and fair and just. We have to talk about building a just economy for all.
Thank you. Dr. McLean, would you like to make any comments?
I just want to say, as I sit here listening, that when we talk about environmental justice or environmental injustice communities, I want to emphasize the fact that they are subject matter experts. They live every day with the impacts and the effects. And they struggle to build their capacity to have voice in the decision-making process, so that it's not just our passion that we bring, but we also bring insight, we also bring analysis. And the Environmental Justice Bill for All actually calls for, in Section 17, Environmental Justice Basic Training, a program where we actually empower, we build the capacity, we skill people up, we give them the tools to come to the table and be able to develop solutions and remedies. And we don't have to all be scientists and researchers, because we have Dr. Bullard. But we all know what we live every day. And this is not just about Black communities. This is for all communities, including poor white communities. A lot of times we ignore poor white people who are also being impacted by environmental injustice. We don't have to just look at communities of color. So I think our job, Congresswoman, and I love you, is to really build that voice so that they know how to have a discourse around renewable energy. They know how to have a discourse around cumulative impacts. They know about pipelines. The northeastern states, the southeastern states, many residents have come and said, we don't want a pipeline. So how do you listen to those voices? And how do you compare to those voices to the ones who say, yeah, we want it? Like I said, there are two sides to every story, and we have got to begin to listen to the subject matter experts. I'm gonna repeat that, subject matter experts that is found in our people.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
So that's just, Mr. Gosar, I believe Mr. Stauber is next, if I'm not mistaken. If so, he's recognized.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, thank you very much. My questions are for Mr. Hawley. Thank you for appearing before this committee today. Your testimony today is enlightening and provides insight into issues facing northern Minnesota and the rest of the country. In your written testimony, you mentioned the Atlantic Coast Pipeline being shut down arbitrarily by red tape. In a similar vein, the Enbridge Replacement Line 3 pipeline project in my district seeks to replace a half-century-old pipeline operating at half capacity with a state-of-the-art one. It'll create more than 6,000 jobs and provide a $2 billion boost to our economy, especially as COVID shutdowns are causing unemployment rates higher than 20% in some counties the pipeline runs through. Mr. Hawley, can you tell me how attacking this project with ideology and wrapping it in further red tape is, quote, just, end quote, for the communities in my district that want cheap energy and high wage union protected jobs?
Well, it sounds as if, like you said, they're going through the same challenges they did with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And unfortunately, these same communities that by canceling this pipeline that they were claiming to help, they're now, these communities are now going to be left without. As I stated in my testimony, it wasn't just the pipeline. There were a lot of things that were going to come along in addition to, like a fire station, a fully funded fire station for that area, which they've never had before.
Right. I I represent a vast and cold district in northern Minnesota. Last winter, I saw a recorded temperature of 68 degrees below zero. We need low energy costs to heat our homes. Reading through the bill today, I found no provision that actually lowers energy costs or mentions it at all. Instead, Mr. Hawley, could you share with me policies that would actually lead to lower energy costs so my constituents can heat their homes?
Yes, sir. Access to affordable and reliable energy like natural gas. And even my colleagues on the left right now, I think they would agree that people like Reverend Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and Mark Muriel, who's the president of the National Urban League, back in March 2020 this year, the Axios article came out where they all are supportive of natural gas. And they said natural gas, Mark Muriel said, it's the fuel that we need to have access to because the transition to alternatives is a long-range transition. So we need natural gas as we transition to a more cleaner energy.
So would you consider this bill today not helping reduce the cost of natural gas for these hard-hit communities?
Absolutely. It's not going to lower the cost of natural gas for these communities.
Mr. Hawley, thanks for your testimony. And in closing, I am proud to join Mr. Hearn's Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act, which truly finds solutions to our energy needs. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me now recognize Ms. DeGette for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for your leadership in writing this really important bill and all the work from the committee and from all around the country in this legislation. I believe every American deserves clean air, clean water, safe food, safe neighborhoods. But as several of our witnesses have said today, for decades, that has all been contingent on what your zip code is, and that is just simply wrong. Members like me who have diverse urban districts represent areas like Swansea, Elyria, Globeville, which are hardworking neighborhoods that have suffered from environmental injustice for years. And that's why I'm so honored that you in particular put my program authorized by the Every Kid Outdoors Act permanent in this bill. What that bill does, it allows fourth grade students and their families to visit any federally managed parks, lands, or waters for free for an entire year. And what it does is it gets all the kids in my district out to our wonderful natural areas in Colorado. I'd like to enter in the record 2 letters. The first from the National Wildlife Federation and the second from the Western Environmental Law Center endorsing the overall bill and my provisions in particular. I'd ask unanimous consent to enter those 2 letters in.
Thank you. Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Ms. Vidaurre, why is access to public lands and waters an environmental justice issue?
Thank you for the question. You briefly mentioned it too. I mean, it happens in your community. It happens in communities all over where instead of green space or parks or places to go, a lot of that land is rezoned from either recreational, commercial, or residential to industrial so that they can continue to pile on different developments. And so we see the ratio of treescape, or we see the ratio of green space to industrial space being very far from each other. And so here we actually have the San Bernardino Mountains, we have the San Gregorio Mountains, all in an area, and you'd be surprised how many people don't go and enjoy these natural resources that we have so close to us.
Yeah, you're right. You know, in Denver here, I've met people who have never been to the mountains, even though the mountains are like 30 minutes away. And so it's these neighborhoods I talked about. The highways go right over what little tiny green areas that people have. And so they're breathing in the fumes there. And that's why it's so important. And I really appreciate it. I just have another quick question for Dr. McLean. Last week, the House adopted 2 of my amendments to the Clean Energy Jobs and Innovation Act, which are relevant to this bill. The first one requires the EPA to develop a protocol to assess and address the cumulative health effects of multiple sources of pollution and other environmental stress. And the second one asks the EPA to identify 100 communities that have been overburdened by violations of environmental law and address the systemic problems in those violations. And so, Dr. McLean, I want to ask you, is it unusual to see an excessive number of violations in environmental law in communities of color, low income or otherwise marginalized communities?
No, it's not. And I say that because historically, inequities have existed across the board, almost in every aspect of our lives. We have not just entered the environmental justice fight the last 20, 30 years. It has been a fight that we have been in all of our lives, because we just have to say it out clearly that America still has a job in dismantling systemic racism in both our institutions, our policies, and our practices. So we kind of expect what we're getting. And so we are looking forward to this bill being enacted so that we can have a stronger tool to help us to fight. But trust me, we're going to keep on fighting, because eventually we're going to make America for all Americans. And all of us are going to be able to breathe clean air, drink good water, grow food in our gardens. We're going to be healthy, and we're going to learn to love one another. Yes, we are.
And it starts with a healthy environment for our children. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gosar, is there someone on your side of the aisle that, on your side of the dais, that needs to be recognized? I don't have the name.
I'd like to be heard.
Mr. Gomer, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. And I do appreciate that. I appreciate all of the witnesses being here today. I hope it's not a surprise that all of us on both sides of the aisle want a clean environment, clean water, clean air, and we want affordable energy. Because if you look at countries around the world, only countries with a vibrant economy are able to truly have clean environments. You go back to civilizations that ceased to exist because they didn't take care of their environment. Well, they got to a place where there just wasn't enough assets to take care of it, and that ended up bringing about the end. And I'll never forget an 80-year-old constituent of mine from rural East Texas saying back when gasoline prices got over $3 a gallon and propane, electricity, everything was up high. And she said, I'm really concerned. I grew up in a home where the only energy source we had was a wood-burning stove. And I'm really concerned that because of the price of energy, I'm going to leave this world in a home with only a wood-burning stove. And this was during the Obama administration. And I said, I am so sorry to tell you, but if the Obama administration gets their way, you won't have a wood-burning stove. You'll be without anything. I recall back when the cap and trade bill was being pushed by Speaker Pelosi, John Dinkle, I really have so much respect for the man, a great admiration, a man of honesty. I always found we disagreed on many things, but he was always so honest. He was looking forward to pushing through Obamacare, some form of socialized medicine, but he would not bring the cap and trade bill out. And he famously said, the cap and trade bill, which so many were looking forward to, because it was supposed to clean up the environment. He said, it's not only a tax, it's a great big tax. And it was on the people who could least afford it. Because really rich people, it's an inconvenience for them to pay high electricity or gas prices, but it's just an inconvenience. When you're in poverty or you're close to the poverty line and all of your energy from what you put in your car to how you heat or get energy in your home goes up, it is absolutely devastating. So if that's the way we go, we're going to need a whole lot more programs to send people to our national park paying for that, because our poor are going to get poorer. But Mr. Hawley, let me ask you, do you know people that would be considered to be in poverty that would be impacted as the price of energy skyrockets? You recall President Obama said that price of energy would necessarily skyrocket when he did away with some of our fossil fuel sources.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. I know I've spoken to thousands of them, literally thousands of people, but I can point to an example closer to home, using my mother-in-law, who's senior citizen right here in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, senior citizens, and where she was at our home a couple of months ago and she was complaining about her electric bill. And it was about the mandates that that have imposed on the residents of the District of Columbia as they move towards renewables and a more green structure, if you will. And so here, my mother-in-law, 83 years old, she's paying for fees for things like charging stations that she will never benefit from. And there's other people in other residents of the District of Columbia who are low income, who don't make that kind of money and still have to pay for these mandates that are being imposed on them right now.
Wow, that sounds so abysmal. But I hope that we don't do more damage to the nation's poor, because that hurts the economy, and then we don't have enough help for those that really need it, who are becoming deeper poverty. But thank you for your sharing your own experiences. I see I'm out of time, and so I yield back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Gomer. Let me recognize Congressman Garcia. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, and of course, the panelists joining us today. Let me cut to the chase. We know all communities want clean air, clean water, and an environment that enriches life. In 2020, Chicago still has an uneven and inequitable exposure to pollution and toxins across its neighborhoods. My neighborhood, Little Village, ranks at the 99th percentile in the U.S. for air pollution that causes cancer and other respiratory hazards. It's no surprise that kids in my community are hospitalized for asthma at 3 times the rate of other parts of Chicago. And in the middle of the pandemic, my community that has been hit the hardest in the entire state continues facing barriers to water access. This is a matter of life and death. Chicago's environmental problems are closely tied to the persistent health, economic, and racial inequities that have developed over decades. A question for Dr. Bullard. Thank you for being here. All the work that you've done to address the environmental justice movement for decades. The question, our communities are being ravaged by COVID-19, an unprecedented economic crisis, and other pressing issues. How do we connect environmental justice issues to other pressing concerns our communities face? And how do we maintain environmental justice at the forefront of our communities during these times?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. I think it's important that we understand that the way that the environmental justice movement defines the environment is where we live, work, play, learn, worship, as well as the physical and natural world. And because of that intersectionality, we're talking about addressing the air pollution that you talked about, the facilities that's creating lots of the health problems. And it does no good if you can get your energy bill paid if you can't breathe. So I think most people will also prioritize breathing. So we have to make sure that the justice part is lifted up no matter what we're talking about. Transportation, when we talk about transportation, you have transportation justice. We talk about energy, accessibility. It doesn't matter if you got a park that's 30 miles away. If you don't have access to transportation to get there, the park might as well be on the moon. When we talk about the intersectionality with what's going on in policy, rolling back NEPA, environmental protection, rolling back and trying to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. People are underinsured or no insured. COVID is creating more unemployment, and the workers that have to go to work and can't telework is a frontline workers and disproportionately people of color. All these things are tied together when we talk about environmental justice, economic justice, health justice, racial justice. And so we have to make sure it's very clear what we're talking about. It's more than talking about energy and pipelines, which is important. It's more than talking about energy poverty. We're also talking about poverty. We're also talking about people not living in food deserts where there are no grocery stores. And we're talking about people that don't have access to a clinic, healthcare. These all things have to be put together and not just disaggregated and only concentrate on one thing. It's all tied together.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. For Dr. McCain, in your testimony, you mentioned the importance of citizen involvement and the opportunity and the right to participate in the decision-making process. Why is it so critical for communities of color to sit at the decision-making table, especially in the environmental space? You got one minute.
Because it's been said that we are subject matter experts. We live with it every day. We have a right to have a voice. This is a democratic society. We have a right to have a vote. We have a right to say, because we do know some solutions and remedies. We don't just talk about what the problem is. We have solutions. We have remedies. We have institutions that we are attached to that have solutions and remedies. So we need to be at the table, and we're going to be there.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to submit the NHLA policy agenda into the record. The NHLA is a coalition of over 40 most prominent national Latino advocacy organizations. It's the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda and their policy statement on these issues.
Thank you. Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And it's in support of the Environmental Justice for All Act.
Thank you, sir. Gentleman yields. Mr. Gosar, is there another person on your side of the dais that wishes to be recognized that has not spoken?
We don't have anybody yet, so.
Okay.
Chairman.
Let me, yes?
No, we don't have it. You don't have
Okay,
anybody yet.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar. Let me recognize Ms. Barragan. Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses today. I am so grateful to be a part of this committee and be here for this very, very critical hearing. Chairman Grijalva and Representative McEachin, thank you again for all your work, your leadership on this issue, on the Environmental Justice for All bill, which I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of. An important bill of mine, the Outdoors for All Act, is included in the legislation, which expands access to parks in urban areas with the priority for underserved communities. In our fight for true environmental justice, every decision, every law, and every program impacting our environment and the people who live in it have to prioritize racial equity. Now, the majority of Latino and African American district that I have, almost 90%, is sandwiched between highways, refineries, and urban oil drilling. As a result, my neighbors and our community members can't breathe. We've had the highest level of air pollution in the country. It's unacceptable. And we cannot settle for anything less than a clean and safe environment for all people. Not more half measures of greenwash solutions, not more diesel death zones, cancer alleys, or flints. We can rise to the occasion and advance climate and environmental justice centered on racial justice. While no one bill is going to solve these issues, the Environmental Justice for All Act puts in place the legal protections and support for environmental justice communities so we can all move forward together. Mr. Bullard, I want to start with you. Action for Protection. You wrote about the unequal government response to natural disasters impacting Black communities compared to white communities. Can you describe how the Environmental Justice for All Act can help ensure that communities of colors receive equal treatment? Doctor?
You were cutting out, but I think I got the gist of your question. In looking at the way the government historically has responded to natural and man-made disasters, in the book that I wrote, The Wrong Complexion for Protection, that looked at 8 decades of government response, we found that government systematically did not respond the same when it came to low-income communities and communities of color and affluent white communities. What this act does is to address the fact that that pattern needs to be stopped. If we just use strictly the same dominant paradigm of cost-benefit analysis and assume that the money will go to the pattern of money follows money, money follows power, money follows whites. That's the way the research shows over 8 decades in that round right now. And so what it means is that money should follow need. There should be a equity lens that's applied to disaster response, such as the Stafford Act, not just assuming that we will follow the same $800,000 homes on the west side of Houston that will get the recovery dollars, whereas the $80,000 homes on the east side will get left behind. That's the kind of lens that we need to apply, overlay, that will correct the built-in injustice that have occurred, as I said before, over 8 decades, and not assume that everything being equal, everybody's gonna come to the table and the evaluation will be neutral. No, there is no neutrality when we come to how disaster response has been allocated across the board.
Well, thank you for that. We still have a lot of work to do. I appreciate your comments. Ms. Waxman, in your work at Uprose, you worked on a solar project in the Sunset Park in Brooklyn, which is New York's first solar energy cooperative. Can you tell me a little bit about the project, the importance of community-owned clean energy systems, and how the environmental justice grants funding in this legislation could help support more of these projects? Ms. Waxman?
With us. Ms. Waxman is not one of the witnesses at this point.
Oh, I apologize. Well, let me just conclude by thanking the chairman and our witnesses today for all the work that you're doing on environmental justice. We need to come together. We are facing a climate crisis, and we know we're at a time where communities of color are being left behind. This legislation is so critical in making sure that we're getting equal treatment and that our frontline communities that are being hit first and worst are not left behind, but are put at the front of the line. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for, again, holding this hearing, and know that you have a partner in making sure we get justice for all. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me now recognize the chair of the Public Lands Committee, Ms. Congresswoman Holland. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, colleagues. First, I would just like to say that protecting our environment is not radical. I want to make sure that's on the record. And my first question will go to Ms. Andrea. Ms. Andrea, I'm sorry, I don't want to mess up your last name, so I will just call you Ms. Andrea. 90% of the Albuquerque metro's areas, that's in my district, metro areas' industrial sources of pollution are located in the South Valley, as well as 2 federally designated Superfund sites. The South Valley is traditionally a Hispanic, low-income, primarily Spanish-speaking rural part of Albuquerque. According to a 2011 health impact assessment by the Bernalillo County Place Matters team, Hispanic people living there have significantly higher death rates than those in other parts of the county for 10 of 11 leading causes of death, including heart disease and cancer. A litany of research has found correlations between environmental burdens, stress, and premature deaths in communities like the San Jose neighborhood, where life expectancy is 10 years less than those in the rest of Albuquerque. And that's just a small area. I've had neighborhood leaders and residents from the South Valley tell me they want to keep the Superfund sites on EPA's Superfund list. Usually folks want sites in their neighborhood cleaned up and then removed from the list, but in the South Valley, they're so afraid that once the Superfund sites are declared cleaned up, industry will just come back in and start polluting them again. So they see the Superfund designation as protection from all of that. So my question is, can you speak to how the situation is similar to the ones in your communities and other environmental justice communities face, and how the Environmental Justice for All Act will help my South Valley and other such communities break free of these environmental health burdens?
Thank you so much for the question. And interesting to hear that what's happening in the area also is happening out here. I mentioned it a bit in my testimony, but a fight that we had at the San Bernardino airport, the one that we found out about through a newspaper article, was a development on top of a Superfund site that had been supposedly cleaned up, and that they were going to be putting warehouse complexes over. That area actually used to be an Air Force base, and so it was technically public land, and they were going to redevelop it, and they were supposed to redevelop it for the benefit of the community. Instead, it was sold off to a private developer who develops a bunch of industrial sites across the nation. And so we saw it was a perfect opportunity for community to get involved and to decide like what could happen in this area that could greatly benefit an area that didn't have too many access to parks, that don't have access to trees and et cetera. And on top of it had a Superfund site, but instead sold off and nobody really got to know about it or get involved. And so the EJ for All Act does highlight the importance of not only community engagement, but also to analyze and do something about cumulative impacts. If that area would have had, let's say, the provisions that are in the EJ for All Act, we might have been able to develop something that was in a better use for the community. I mentioned in my testimony about how a lot of the development that happens in this area isn't the unionized jobs that we're talking about. They aren't the high wage jobs. They aren't the cleanest jobs. So a package that we don't get to have, but community here locally is fighting for something that brings in both. And unfortunately, we haven't had the chance to be able to engage, because there's always ways that either it's streamlined or the comments, we're not giving extended time for comments, or even sometimes the analysis that they do, the study areas that they do, they don't do it large enough to actually grab the entire area that's going to be impacted. So I think for an area like yours, the provisions that I had just mentioned would be helpful.
May be enough time. I'll go ahead on my next question. We'll see how far we get. And this would be for Ms. McLean. Sovereign Native nations have a unique government-to-government relationship with the United States. Tens of millions of indigenous people inhabited North America long before European governments sent explorers to seize lands and resources from the continent and its inhabitants. Following the founding of the U.S., our country implemented policies forced Native people from their lands, moved many of our people to places that were much less suitable for sustaining life. And to this day, many tribal communities lack running water, or the water they do have is contaminated by runoff from abandoned mines or other sources of pollution. As we seek to address the wide range of historical, racial, economic, and environmental injustices that Native Americans have faced and continue to face, are there any particular things that I know are at times limited that you think we need to keep in mind with regard to the special relationship between the U.S. and tribal governments in this act?
I think I heard you, but I would say that we have to respect the sovereignty of the indigenous nations. We have to respect their treaties, and they have to be involved just like any other community, but even for me, even more so, because they are the indigenous people of this land, and they deserve to be represented and to have a greater voice in what the decisions are being made by the federal government. The Environmental Justice for All Act provides for that.
Thank you.
I yield, Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, With that, let me turn now to Mr. Horsford. Let me recognize the gentleman from Nevada.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to Ms. McEachin and the other leaders on this legislation. For too long, communities of color, indigenous communities, and economically oppressed communities have borne a disproportionate burden from toxic pollution and environmental degradation. Communities experience environmental injustice, have been subjected to systemic racial, social, and economic human health and environmental effects. A high risk of intentional, unconscious, and structural discrimination and disproportionately energy burdens on their community. Conclusions from scientists at the National Center for Environmental Assessment confirm that Black people are exposed to about 1.5 times more particulate matter than their white counterparts. So we've got a lot of work to do because the consequences of this are dire. Across the United States, Black people are dying from COVID-19 at disproportionately high rates, and the links between exposure to pollutants and your life expectancy are undeniable. So this legislation is necessary to ensure economic justice for all Americans. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce 2 letters for the record. The first is from the Texas Environmental Advocacy Services, which states that the environmental justice must strengthen the Civil Rights Act to ensure that citizens can rely on a more equitable process to protect their right to a clean environment.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I'd also like to introduce a letter for the record from the Alliance from the Appalachia, which states that the Environmental Justice for All Act is landmark legislation that is rooted in the moral principle that all people have the right to clean air, water, and soil.
Again, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Dr. Bullard, it is obvious that communities of color are being burdened the greatest as a result of environmental injustice. Can you please explain how the census count this year can help improve the health disparities for communities of color? And also, how has the civil rights violations within agency environmental programs currently been managed?
Let me say that having a total census count means a lot when it comes to the potential for addressing environmental justice. If we have a total count and have people who are able to have the right numbers, and the right representation, and proportionate to getting people additional legislators, etc., having the right amount of money that comes to to a particular area to really impact the population and not being undercounted, those have economic impacts, environmental impacts, as well as political impacts. If we look at the government, federal governmental agencies that are charged with enforcement of environmental regulation, environmental protection, as well as health protections, the federal government has not done enough to implement existing laws. And with the emphasis on rollbacks of environmental protection and streamlining and fast tracking permits, many communities that I have visited and talked to say fast tracking is a fast track to the hospital and the cemetery. So when we talk about the implications of getting it right, if we don't get it right, we're going to have more illnesses and more deaths, and we can have less representation and fewer people who are counted legitimately as it's supposed to be the total count in the census.
Okay. Dr. McLean, a lot of my population in my district is in the urban area. I also represent 6 rural communities that are spread out across 52,000 square miles, including 5 Native nations in our community, in our district. So can you explain how this bill and its NEPA provisions will benefit those diverse constituencies and how they can have a voice in the process, please?
Oh, you just hit it on the head, that last part of your question. It reinforces the presence and the requirement, the mandatory requirement for all stakeholders, whether they be Black, brown, indigenous, or whatever, to be at the table, because when you're talking about a federal action taking place, there's going to be some impact on the environment, the ecology, the economy, the health, and the cultural norms of those communities. They bear the brunt of decisions on a daily basis. They don't live in Washington. They live in their neighborhoods and in their communities. And our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, our Pledge of Allegiance to the flag says that we as Americans have a voice. We are in a democracy. We are in a democratic society, and democracy is based on for the people, by the people, of the people, with the people. And so those people that you serve, those people that I live around, and everybody on this call, wherever you live, there are impacted communities that have no voice. You cannot show me one state where there is a community where every voice is heard. This bill reinforces what NEPA has tried to do since its inception.
Thank
It
you.
also
Thank you very
attempts
much.
to codify some things. And so for us, because we were so involved in the development of even the language in this bill, we are so tied to it. And we trust the process that at the end, the outcomes are going to be favorable.
Great. Thank you so much. I know my time has expired. I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Perfect. Let me now ask the Chair of the Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you, Chairman Grijalva, for holding this important hearing. And I also want to thank Representative McEachin for the leadership on this issue and on the introduction of the Environmental Justice for All Act. I think it's one of the most important bills during my period, in Congress. I'm most touched by the testimony and the written testimony and the public testimony from I think it's Andrea Vidaurre. I represent the other area that leads to all of many of your problems. I represent the Port of Long Beach, and Representative Vidaurre, who represents the Port of LA. In our times, we have worked with some of the massive kinds of environmental pollution around our ports. But you, with the working with the People's Collective for Environmental Justice, have really laid out a picture that we all need to hear. You're the other part of this equation. You are described a community that was sacrificed, that once was suburban and rural, into profitable sacrifice, profitable for the benefit of large corporations. And not only has it impacted the nature of your community in terms of environmental justice issues, of the large numbers of trucks, of trains, of that come into your community and stop there, but you've also highlighted some of the other conditions, that is of a wage theft, that this has brought about misclassification of drivers, which we've seen starting in my area, that you see even more so in your area about the Lisbon, and the unsafe working conditions. So I want to applaud you on laying that out. And there are two issues I'd like you to kind of address if you want to. One is, have California laws, CEQA, and also other laws by CARB to kind of clean up, have they helped at all? Have they dealt with the issue which I think you have really raised, and that's the need for a cumulative analysis on, and that really, I think, is the crucial issue that you've raised, that, if we do it piece by piece, we never see the total impact. of what goes on. And you have definitely laid out that need. So I'm asking, has state law at all helped at all in this issue as you watch this deterioration occurring? Obviously, federal law has not helped as much as it should. Maybe you might want to elaborate more on, just as you've already done, on, because I see the core issue is cumulative measures. And so I'd kind of like to ask you about that. And thank you for your work.
Sure. Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, this is good. So a lot of people do think because California has stricter laws that we might have less environmental justice issues, but it's all of the opposite. I mean, we have drilling, we have refineries, we have highways. I mean, we're such a large piece of the economy and unfortunately the economy is such an extractive economy still, that a lot of those problems still exist in California. So CEQA, so something that we heard a lot, especially with different props that were running last year, was that CEQA is stopping affordable housing. CEQA is making the barriers, and we have to reach affordable housing numbers, RIA numbers, and we got many calls about that. And what I had to tell these folks every single time, I was like, you know what, CEQA at the end of the day is an analysis. It is not a decision, it is an analysis. So at the end of the day, this analysis will show that there's significant impact, mitigation, there's nothing that you can mitigate on all the levels, on traffic, on air quality, on greenhouse gases. That'll go up in front of an elected official board. They decide if they get to override CEQA every single time. And that's what happens. That's why we have all of these different facilities in the region, because there's still this structural racism that exists in some of our cities, where there's still this belief that all of this stuff should go into this part of the community. And they'll do that, they'll override these decisions. So at the end of the day, CEQA, all it does is really give us an analysis, which in part is good. We're able to show, hey, it's not just us that is telling you that we feel the impacts. Look at this analysis, right? End of the day, they'll stop. So it doesn't stop affordable housing, and it doesn't stop projects, because we still see all these projects come through, just come into my community. And then the second one was CARB. So CARB is doing a lot right now to push for electric trucks, sales mandates, and eventually they're going to be talking about turning over the fleets. What's I think really important about CARB right now and engaging CARB is that right now is the opportunity to say, if as we're transitioning out of this fuel and out of this late economy, we have to make sure that we're doing it better than it was done before. I mentioned the misclassified drivers. I mentioned the low wages. I didn't mention, but there's this huge use of temp agencies in the Inland Empire. That means that someone like my father, who's worked someplace for 8 years, has never seen a wage increase in 8 years, has never had health insurance for 8 years, because they just use them as temporary workers. Those types of systems in our industry need to change as we transition over. So as CARB thinks about transitioning fleets and bringing more electric trucks into our communities, it's like, how do we make sure that those labor laws that were always also inflicted change this time around? I hope that answered some of the question.
Thank you very much. And I have more questions, but I yield back. I've already.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal.
I have one more thing, Mr. I would like to introduce into the record comments from the Moving Forward Network.
Thank you very much, and without objection, so ordered. Mr. Tonko, you're recognized, sir. Thank you for your patience.
You're welcome, and thank you, Chairman Grijalva, Congressman McEachin, for the very important focus that is poured on environmental justice with this hearing. I especially appreciate the process you undertook to listen to community input, and thank you for our witnesses, all of our witnesses, for joining us today. It is clear that systematic racial injustices exist across the environmental space. Communities that have long faced the worst injustices continue to suffer more air pollution and vulnerability to our changing climate. As a Congress, we must work to restore environmental justice for our communities of color and low-income. This means fully understanding the disproportionate pollution impacts experienced by communities of color and addressing, mitigating, and preventing these impacts. I strongly support building capacity of environmental justice community groups in frontline communities. As you know, Section 16 of the Environmental Justice for All Act focuses on access to environmental justice grant programs. It authorizes some $75 million annually for grants to support research, education, outreach, development, and implementation of projects to address environmental and public health issues in environmental justice communities. So Dr. Bullard, can you further discuss, please, why these grants programs are needed?
Yes, sir. Thank you for your question. I think it's important that it's clear that when we talk about building capacity of community-based organizations, that capacity oftentimes can't get built without resources. And when we talk about building those capacities, we're talking about partnerships. And oftentimes we can create community university partnerships that can develop the kinds of research and the kinds of understanding, the kinds of analyses, the kinds of support that can go a long way in building that empowerment, education, so that people can speak for themselves. The first principle of environmental justice is that those communities that are most impacted on the front line should speak for themselves. And in order for them to speak for themselves, they need to have resources and the kinds of training and the capacity building that's necessary to get them to that level. And research grants is a good way.
Okay, and do you believe this legislation fully addresses the need?
I think this legislation does go a long way in addressing that. Yes, sir.
Wonderful, thank you. And Ms. Vidaurre, in your testimony, you said that community groups on the ground and in direct contact with the public need resources and support to provide free tools, materials, and guidance to address environmental concerns. You also discussed challenges in accessing these resources. Can you further discuss why this is so important as well as the current challenges that exist in accessing these resources?
Yeah, so I think others have laid out why it's so important for community groups like ours to be engaged in the process, especially to fill gaps that exist, especially with outreach and dissemination of information and building capacity. But some of the obstacles that we have encountered are especially with like federal grants, and there are EJ grants, but many of them give the money on the back end, right? Many times we're kind of need to front the money or front the resources, and then we get them in return. And that is an obstacle, right? Because a lot of organizations here, we don't have like $1 million budget or anything, right? We're smaller organizations with like less than 10 people staff, and we have to distribute that evenly. And so those are one of the barriers. Sometimes the complex application are barriers, and the restrictions on what we're able to do with that money. I'll do an example of something that I thought was really great. So here in California, there's a grant called the Community Air Grant, and that money gives money into community groups to do engagement and education and research. They saw a lot of groups were like, we're not going to be able to front up this money for, let's say, the monitoring or the research. So they gave a 25% upfront of that grant before the work was done. So that allowed us to do some of that work. So some of those types of measures, and honestly talking to other groups on how they engage with this, I think would be helpful in making sure that the grants work better this time around.
Thank you. And do you believe this legislation addresses some of these challenges?
I do. I think that this legislation does move us in that direction of starting to highlight the importance of these groups and getting funded.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I can't see the clock, but do I have time available remaining?
Very little.
Well, let me then ask quickly, Dr. Bullard. Section 17 of the legislation establishes an environmental justice basic training program. Is there a need for such a program?
Yes, sir, there is.
Okay. Well, with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back and thank you.
Thank you, my friend. There's no other members to ask questions. Let me close by thanking the witnesses for providing the testimony. It was very good, and all the witnesses. I was going to ask some questions, but it got covered about a cumulative effect. You can't deal with a situation like, the cancer corridor or cancer highway in Louisiana, 153 petrochemical plants, each a permitted use, each having emissions, each having waste that they dispose of. And you can't treat one in isolation, the new one, without dealing with what the other 152 contribute to those communities that are around there. So community effect from the beginning has been a big issue. Providing some enforcement and some redress for communities through the Civil Rights Act, and strengthening NEPA so that the right to know by all communities is available to frontline and environmental justice communities as well. The right to know is very important. And I think the other thing we try to craft in there together, Mr. McEachin and the groups that and all the groups that we work with and all the feedback we've got is the fact that there has to be some resource support, both for the transition, but more importantly for communities themselves to be able to get their own expertise and be able to participate in the public processes, NEPA or otherwise, but have the wherewithal and the leadership capacity to be able to deal with and, quite frankly, protect and defend their neighborhoods. The other thing is that the narrative changes. Yes, it's about energy costs. It's so much what you pay at the pump. It's about utilities, and but the reality here is that we have a historical legacy with these communities. I'm in a zip code that leads the state in the infection rate and mortality rate around coronavirus. I'm also in a zip code where I grew up, where we were a Superfund site for 23 years as they cleaned up the polluted aquifer from industry and the Air Force. So these are not rare things that happen to some people. And I just really feel that when you're talking about potentially 40 million Americans, 11 million most closely impacted, that they're not collateral damage in this discussion, that the issues of equity and the issues of equal protection applies to them as well. And while there'll be efforts to change the narrative and to try to make it something else, we're talking about the Atlanta pipeline, the community supported it. It was interesting that Dominion and Duke were willing to give a community $5.12 million on the condition that the community support the pipeline and support it going under the trail. When that community wasn't able to do that, obviously it's not there. No comment about the 3-judge panels that said that environmental justice should be a box you check off. Supreme Court gave them the opportunity again to those companies, and issues of money, profitability, and market share became the issues that pipeline was ended, not because of delays or of the opposition that some communities along that route gave to that pipeline. But having said all that, we have our work cut out ahead of us on this bill. I think it is a good bill. Mr. McEachin and I have relied on the expertise and the knowledge and the information from organizations and individuals across this country, and of that, as Mr. McEachin said, we are very, very proud. To my colleagues that were part of this, thank you for taking my time, and to all the 3 witnesses, four witnesses, excellent information. I appreciate it, and with that, the hearing is adjourned, and I extend to all of you again my appreciation and my thanks.